Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Chris Simpson, Programs Lead at the Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center. We are so glad you are all here for another installment of Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center's Book Talk. This virtual series focuses on books related to our work on Holocaust education, defending human rights, and combating anti-Semitism, racism, and other forms of hate. We are excited to have Richard Hurowitz on this evening's program, who will speak about his book, In the Garden of the Righteous. A special thank you to the Jewish Book Council. Both Richard and FSWC are members of the organization. This session is being recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, so folks who are unable to attend can watch at a later date. You are welcome to submit your questions using the chat function throughout the program, and we will do our best to get to them during the Q&A portion of this evening. I am proud to be joined by my colleague Robert Sarner, Senior Editor and Writer at the Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center and host of Book Talk. On that note, I will hand it over to you, Robert.
Thank you, Chris, and good evening. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening for this latest edition of FSWC's Book Talk series and the fourth installment in our fall season. I'm thrilled to have with us here tonight as our featured author, Richard Hurowitz, who's joining us live from his home in New York City. We'll be discussing his nonfiction book, In the Garden of the Righteous, which certainly lives up to its subtitle, The Heroes Who Risked Their Lives to Save Jews During the Holocaust. A paperback edition of the book was published earlier this year, following its hardcover edition that came out in 2023. Later in our program, as Chris just mentioned, we plan to take questions from the audience, so please do use the chat box at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions. During the Q&A, we'll also be giving everyone a chance, actually, to win a free copy of In the Garden of the Righteous as part of our contest involving questions relating to the book. Courtesy of Richard's publisher, HarperCollins, will be giving away 4 copies of In the Garden of the Righteous. I finished reading it this past weekend, and I can certainly tell you it was a deeply moving experience to learn about these real-life heroes for whom saving Jews from the Nazis was simply the natural thing to do, despite the extreme danger that they faced. While on one hand, it's uplifting to read these mesmerizing stories against the backdrop of the Holocaust, it's also highly sobering to be reminded of just how relatively few people had the moral clarity and courage of these righteous men and women. How less tragic the Holocaust would have been if only the conduct of these saviors was not the norm as opposed to the rare exception. Now, for those of you not already familiar with our guest author this evening, this brief bio will help you get to know him a little bit better. Born in New York, where he still lives today, Richard Hurowitz is a widely published writer focusing primarily on economics, history, and global politics. His op-eds and articles have appeared in numerous newspapers and magazines, including the New York Times, the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Times of London, the Boston Globe, Time Magazine, and the Jerusalem Post. He's also the publisher of the Octavian Report, a magazine focused on geopolitics, economics, and culture. And he's the CEO of an investment firm. As if that wasn't enough, Richard is also a lawyer and a trained historian, a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Europe Center. He's a lifetime member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He was a co-founder and president of the Renewed Democracy Initiative, an organization dedicated to defending liberal democracy. It's now my great pleasure to welcome Richard to Book Talk this evening.
Well, thank you, and it's a real privilege to be here. I'm looking forward to this conversation, and I'm a huge fan of Toronto for what it's worth. So.
Well, thank you, Richard, for taking the time to be here with us this evening. Before we start our discussion, I just want to mention that I've long been fascinated by the righteous among the nations. And as such, I found your book extremely rewarding and quite engaging. Richard, I'd like to begin as we usually do with our Q&A with asking you, in your own words, just to give our audience a brief overview of what the book actually is.
Sure. Yeah. So the book is so the title is In the Garden of the Righteous, and the Garden of the Righteous, for those who don't know, is the place at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem where they actually plant a tree in honor of the righteous, each righteous among the nations. So the book is 10 stories of rescue. So 10 different stories of rescue that took place, people rescuing Jews and others from the Holocaust. And I also, in the introduction and conclusion, talk a little bit about, lessons learned and kind of why this happened and et cetera. But at the end, it's hard. It's 10 stories of rescue that are, should be more well known in my view. So.
Well, I just want to show confirmed citing. This is the book I read and finished this weekend. I'd like to ask you, Richard, an obvious question. What prompted you to write this book? Especially, I imagine you must have known from the outset that it was going to be tremendously demanding, especially in terms of the research involved.
Yeah, I ended up researching in like 12 different languages, and my editor pointed out to me it was like enough research for 10 books because each story required its own sort of real deep dive. I mean, I'll give you there's many reasons I think why I wrote the book, but I'm gonna use a visual here to because it actually is quite a visual thing. I don't know if you can see that on my screen. Am I sharing or no?
Not yet.
Hold on one second. I'm with all those wonderful things you said about me, I'm not competent to, I think, to work Zoom. So, um, which I warned you. Here we go. Okay. So now, okay. All right, there we go. So I would say the book started when I was went to the Holocaust Museum in college, so a number of years ago. And as I've talked to a lot of audiences, people all over the country, all over the world, actually, everyone who's gone to the museum finds the main exhibit extraordinarily upsetting as it's designed to be. And many people see this image on the right, which is a pile of shoes from people who died during the in the concentration camps. And if you look closely, you'll see children's sizes because 1.5 million out of the 6 million were children. And when I saw this as myself, I was in college. It was extremely upsetting. And at the time, I came out. There was a small exhibit on rescue, and I came to these pictures, and I gravitated to them at the time, probably because these kids were around my age, and they were students at the University of Munich, called the White Rose, and they tried to foment an uprising against Hitler by circulating leaflets. The guy on the left, his name is Alexander Schmorell, actually is responsible for the second leaflet, which is one of the first documents we have actually publicizing the Holocaust and saying that what the regime was doing. It's a very sad, tragic story. They were turned in after about a year, a very heroic, and they were real idealists. They were turned in by a maintenance man who was an ardent Nazi. This had gone up to Hitler himself. They were put on summary judgment court, were executed within days. And Sophie Scholl actually had this quote where she said during the trial, everybody in Germany thinks the way we do. They're just afraid to say it, which of course was not true. And anyway, I found the story heartbreaking, but also inspirational and powerful, and it really stayed with me. And a few years ago, on the 75th anniversary of the execution of the White Rose, I wrote an article for the New York Times just telling the story, and it went completely viral. It was one of the top stories of the day. It was trended, wildly on social media. It was shared. I mean, when you write something for the New York Times, the audience is in the millions. And what was remarkable to me was that there wasn't one negative comment in the internet's a dark place. I've written stuff on gold and gotten like Nazi comments. Not one negative comment anywhere on social media that I could find, just only positive. And so I started writing up these stories, and I did 7 articles for the Times and the Wall Street Journal and the LA Times and the Daily Beast, and I had a very similar response to all of them. And so, I also learned that rescue is a very undercovered, area of Holocaust studies and of history. even though in my view these are some of the greatest stories ever told, ever, in human history. And so other than, Schindler and Wallenberg, we know very little. Most people know virtually none of the rescuers, and I wanted to, change that. So, but I also realized there was something really positive about these stories, so that's why I decided to turn them into the book.
In the book's introduction, you refer to the dedication ceremony for the Avenue of the Righteous at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem in 1962. And you quoted from then Israeli Foreign Minister, later Prime Minister, Golda Meir, who said, quote, and I'd like to read what you quoted her, saying, "The Jewish people remember not only the villains, but also every small detail of the rescue attempts. The rescuers were like drops of love in an ocean of poison. They not only saved Jews, but they saved hope and faith in the human spirit," unquote. So that similar thinking, is that partially of what inspired you to write the book?
Yes. I do feel that Jewish people in particular, but I think everybody, all people of goodwill, let's say, owe the rescuers a real debt of gratitude for what they did at the darkest moment. I think we can all agree in human history. And Hannah Shanesh has another very beautiful quote, the paratrooper and poet, who said, she compared the rescuers to extinguished stars. The light comes to the earth many years after the stars are actually, in fact, extinguished. And she said she compared them to that, and she said that, that we see their light long after they're gone, and they light the way for all mankind. And I think this is a similar sentiment that, what they did, which was so rare, really, I think, kind of redeems our hope. I've had I talk a little bit about, people always ask where was God in the Holocaust. And I mean, one place you can probably, if you're a believer, find, is the divine spark in these people. I would say also, I think there's a historical injustice that we all know the names of Heinrich Himmler, and we all know, Hermann Goering, but some of the people in my book are virtually unknown. I mean, these, the White Rose, they're known within Germany. Most people outside don't know who they are. And I think as with, who we value as a society says a lot about who we are. And I think these people deserve much more recognition than they've received, and certainly should be as well known as the Nazi high command.
You referred earlier, Richard, to the enormous amount of research that went into the book. I'm curious, what surprised you in what you may have uncovered during that research?
Well, hmm. Um, I think it's I guess a couple of things. I would say, yeah, there's certain, particularly some of the stories I told involved clandestine networks. And so, uncovering what exactly went on required quite a lot of work. And with any work of history that I want to write, but certainly with anything related to the Holocaust, you have to be, there's 1,000 footnotes in my book. And, we again went through 12 different languages. So, that the process of writing, the stories, to the extent there was murkiness in almost every instance, turned out to be even more unbelievable than I had expected, having heard, like, sort of at the beginning, when you actually got into the heroism of what happened, some of the kind of drama around it. I mean, one thing I would say that is always never ceases to surprise me, although it is I'm used to it now, but is, some the number of people who read the book, or when I was writing articles about it, I would regularly get emails from people saying, that person rescued my family. And then but what always would surprise me is people that I would get that I knew, who would say to me, by the way, like, I'm alive because of this person. And I've had people who have discovered through the book that they were rescued and owe their life to someone in the book. And I think this is amazing, because when you think about some of the people, there's one rescuer that may have saved as many as 30,000 people. And which means today there's like probably several 100,000 people alive just because of his actions. And so that is what they mean, I think, when they talk about, the quote from the Talmud, he who saves one life saves the world, which is on the back of the medal that they give to the righteous among the nations. It's the generational, kind of continued echo down through history. And so there's like, when you think about it, I think just the people in my book, there's probably 1 million people alive today due to the actions of these, the 10 stories in my book, which when you also think about the percentage of the Jewish population in the world right now, it's remarkable. But it always surprises me, to find the surprise, like that somebody I knew, and was rescued by somebody, that I was writing about.
I don't know if this is practical or not, Richard, but perhaps to try to put a face on all of the rescuers in your book, is there a way you could maybe just go through the visuals, introducing very briefly each
Yeah, of
of
course.
the main
Sure.
rescuers that you spotlight in the book?
Yeah, so this is Aristides de Sousa Mendes, who was the Portuguese diplomat in Bordeaux, and he is the one who saved as many as 30,000 people. It's the largest single rescue of any individual during the Holocaust. So if people leave, if they don't know who he is, and I usually take a poll if it's in person beforehand, but if you remember nothing from this talk, remember this man's name, because extraordinarily, he's one of the great humanitarians of the 20th century. That's him on the right with a rabbi who he saved while he was on the ground. The second, I tell the story of a rescue in the circus. This was in Germany. This was a itinerant circus, pretty famous, and they literally hid Jews in during the circus, performing in the circus under assumed names. The owner was the man on the left, who was also the ringmaster, and on the right was his wife, who was an as you can see, was an elephant trainer. Um, these are my Greek protagonists. In the center is Archbishop Damaskinos, later Prime Minister briefly of Greece, and the Chief of Police on the right. They saved thousands of Jews in Athens and in the islands around it, which is an amazing story given that in other parts of Greece there was virtually no survivors. It was the worst outcome of any country in Europe as a percentage. On the left is Princess Alice of Greece, who hid a family in her palace. She's better known actually as the mother of Prince Philip and the grandmother of King Charles. And she's been honored in the Yad Vashem. This is Gino Bartoli. This is one of my favorite stories. He was probably the most famous athlete in Europe. He was an Italian cyclist who won the Tour de France in 1938 and also in 1948. He did a couple of things. He hid the family down on the right in his apartment, but more perhaps unusually, he was a courier for the Assisi Underground. He was carrying in his bike false identity papers for Jews that were hiding in Assisi. You see a picture of Assisi there, which was there'd probably never been a Jew in Assisi before, but they were hiding in the convents and in the cloisters and in the monasteries. This is a picture that was taken outside in real time outside the embassy of a Japanese diplomat who was really a spy on the right, Sugihara. His sister-in-law took this picture. These were Jews that were fleeing Poland that lined up outside of his embassy and sorry, his consulate. And he actually, with this man who was the honorary consul general, he was a businessman from Holland, from the Netherlands. They together gave stamps, and you can see on the right the Japanese stamp. He gave this man to Curacao. The Japanese was a transit visa, and they got out thousands of Jews. This is Irena Sendler, who was a social worker in her late 20s who ran a clandestine network of almost all women and girls. The Jewish girls were inside the ghetto. The non-Jewish women were outside the ghetto, and they smuggled out somewhere around 2,500 children and toddlers and infants. She was later captured, tortured, and almost executed. The Danish rescue is fascinating, which we can talk about how pretty much all the Jews of Denmark were saved. The king is on the left, who was sort of, led, but it was really the entire population. On the bottom, in the inset picture is the guy on the left. This is him and his wife was a rower in the Olympics, and he physically rowed a number of Jews to safety. This is the town of Les Chambon, which was a Protestant village. They were descendants of Huguenots in France, in the kind of the middle of nowhere, and they rescued. They were major figures in the nonviolent movement. This is the pastor and his wife with their 4 children. They weren't from there, and And they saved about 5,000 people, 3,500 children, and they gave them, in addition to that, a normal education, normal life. It was a remarkable story. These are this is the girl on the left who became the woman in the middle was saved in the final days of the war from the death march by 10 British POWs who were themselves imprisoned, and they hid her in a hayloft, and it was quite heroic. These were working class British. And then this is Varian Fry, who was an American intellectual, Harvard educated, was in his early 30s, sent over by Eleanor Roosevelt, saved, large numbers of the intelligentsia of Europe, both Jewish and non-Jewish, many artists, many writers, politicians. He worked with an ensemble. This is Leon Feuchtwanger, who was one of the most famous writers in the world. He was imprisoned briefly in France, and this picture made its way to Eleanor Roosevelt, and this is what triggered the entire rescue. This is him with many of the surrealists, and this is him with Marc Chagall. And in the back, you can see also Hiram Bingham, who was a American diplomat, Yale educated, who was part of a ring and of many Americans actually who saved all of these people. So those are the pictures of the people in the book.
Well, thank you for doing that, Richard, because that really gives a tremendous sense of the diversity also of the rescuers that you spotlight so vividly in the book. Each chapter is almost a book, a world unto itself. The way you bring the various aspects of their rescue operations, the way you bring it alive. Of the 10 chapters, and each one so rich, what was the hardest one for you to write of those 10 chapters?
Well, emotionally, the hardest one by far to write was the one about Irena Sendler, because that took place in Poland. And, when we think about the Holocaust and the real nightmare landscape of the Holocaust, it's pretty much in Poland. It's where the six major death camps were. It's where the Warsaw Ghetto was. And so having to write, she was in and out of the Warsaw Ghetto, and the conditions were just horrendous. And, having to write that and kind of like immerse myself in that and experience it by, through not obviously experience, but to read about it and to hear the first person memoirs. And again, as I mentioned, she was tortured. It was like that was very challenging, and very difficult. And, it's I had been working on another book about my cousin who was at Nuremberg, and his brief was Auschwitz, and I need a break from the from the Holocaust for a bit after that, which is, it's very tough. I mean, it was just, like to read about. She was so immersed in it that there's the famous story of Jan Karski, who smuggled himself into the Belzec concentration camp and also into the Warsaw Ghetto, and then famously reported to Anthony Eden and FDR and was not taken seriously, or sort of, let's say, taken seriously, but not really, nothing happened. She was the one who gave him the tour. She was that, sort of, so following her around was, you just to see, to read what they wrote about the like inhumanity and the conditions that the Nazis, had in the ghetto was difficult.
Hmm. Well, I think that to me, it's interesting you cite uh, that chapter. I think that's the one that stands out the most for me. Uh, the way you evoke the ghetto
Yeah.
and the conditions, and how she, I mean, unbelievable what she did. And as you say, she was then tortured, and how she survived is a miracle in itself. Uh, how about for you, Richard? Which is there one of the heroes that stands out more than anyone else for you?
Well, that's like asking who's your favorite child, but I mean, I think I have a couple of. They're all different, honestly, and that's why I chose them. I mean, the Christian Science Monitor called Sousa Mendes, who I mentioned at the beginning, the breakout star of the book, and his story is pretty amazing. I mean, I have a personal affection because I'm a Italian-phile for Bartoli and the kind of Italian story, and I think that, the Holocaust in Italy is very misunderstood and is, not really focused on, and many Italians were quite heroic actually, and he was this just unusual because he was about as famous a person as there was in Europe. I mean, he was it was like as if he was like equivalent of like LeBron James. He was probably the most famous athlete in Europe, definitely in Italy, and never again as the remarkable thing about all these pretty much all of them is they never really told anybody and they certainly never bragged about what they did. And he was a famous athlete and certainly had the ability to, and there were rumors and he was very insistent that he not, not be given credit for this. And in fact, he actually said, he wanted to be remembered as a cyclist. And he said, there's some medals you get for winning a bicycle race, and they go in your trophy case. He said there are others that you get in the next life and they're pinned to your soul, which is a kind of very beautiful poetic statement and certainly remarkable coming from an athlete who had a sixth grade education. So that's a great. I love the story in the circus, honestly, because it's just so crazy and cinematic. But I think I think they're all not to dodge the question, but they're all pretty mean. I chose them because they all were meaningful to me.
Yeah, when we spoke earlier, I mentioned to you, Richard, I found each one cinematic, each chapter incredibly cinematic, almost fact even more remarkable than fiction. Um, Presumably, you had space allowed for it, additional righteous among the nations that you could have included. Is that
Yes. It
yeah?
was originally supposed to be 15 chapters, and then HarperCollins had a chat with me about not having too long of a book. So, yes.
As it is, very substantial. As
Yeah,
you,
yeah, 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 yeah.
it's almost close to 400 pages, each one quite gripping. Uh, how did you decide, though, on those 10? It must have been very difficult to narrow it
Yeah,
down.
it was, I really tried to. I made a rule that I was going to have people who were on the ground rescuing, and also I didn't want to have any Jewish rescuers, even though they're very important. And I didn't. For example, I think rescue, being showing political leadership was like Winston Churchill was amazing. I just wrote an article for the Wall Street Journal about how Herbert Hoover was, profoundly, who was as bad as FDR was. Hoover was bad, was great, and but that's a different kind of, effort. So I wanted people that were sort of on the ground. I wanted people. I did not choose Wallenberg or Schindler. I talk about them in the introduction because their stories are much more well known. I wanted a kind of cross section across Europe of the different kinds of rescue that people did. I mean, I've cheated a little bit in the sense that there's a number of stories I've written up for some of the publications you mentioned that didn't, they're mentioned in passing in the book, but the stories, for example, Nicholas Winton, who saved over 600 children in Prague. He's very famous. There's a famous clip on the internet of later in life. He was reunited on live television with many of the children he had saved who were then adults. There was a movie just now with Anthony Hopkins. The King of Morocco, who saved all of the Jews, I had written up. The story of Manuel Quezon, the first president of the Philippines, who saved several thousand Jews and actually wanted to have the entire island of Mindanao be host to 1 million Jews. And unfortunately, the war in the Pacific didn't, stop that. I mean, one story I wrote for Time that I've been speaking about recently that is amazing. I spoke in the Senate about it earlier this year, the U.S. Senate, is this Roddy Edmonds, who was a non-commissioned officer from Knoxville, Tennessee, who was probably never met a Jew in his life, was at the Battle of the Bulge, was captured, and I didn't know that the Nazis actually were rounding up American and Canadian, if they, Jews and Allied Jews, which is why the reason on a dog tag, Jewish soldiers were advised not to put their religion, and he found himself with 1,200 soldiers. He was the most senior rank. 100 of them were Jewish Americans. And the commandant, when they got to the POW camp, announced that all the Jews needed to report the next day, and they were going to send them east and disappear them. And Edmonds announced that all soldiers, all 1,200 Americans, would line up in formation, which they did the next morning. And the commandant came over screaming. He said, "You will tell me who are the Jews." And he took his Luger and he literally pointed it at Roddy Edmonds' head. And he responded, and there are multiple eyewitnesses, including, it's like the guy who later hosted a children's show called Wonderama was one of the soldiers. And he was standing right there. And he said that, Edmonds basically said to him, because this was true, he said, the war is almost over. And if you shoot me, you better shoot everyone because you're committing war crimes. And he said, we are all Jews here. We are all Jews. So, the Nazi just ended up backing down, but he had a gun pointed at his head with an irate, screaming, "Tell me who the Jews are," but he refused to do it. So he saved, 200 Jews, American Jewish soldiers. And I mention it also because, the way we honor these people is always weird. So he's been honored at Yad Vashem, but the United States has not given him like the Congressional Medal of Honor, the military, because they take the view that it didn't happen in combat. For some reason, being in a POW camp with a Nazi pointing a gun at your head is not combat. So, rules, kind of trump, common sense. And he has not yet been honored in the United States. And every year the last few years, they put legislation through Congress, which never fails. It always doesn't get enough signatures to give him the Congressional Gold Medal. But anyway, it's an amazing story. I wrote it up, briefly for time on his birthday a couple of years ago. But if I had had room, I would have told his story.
Well, on that note, I mean, when you look back today, is there one rescuer that at the time when you wrote the book, you chose to exclude, perhaps purely for reasons of space, that today in looking back, you wish you had included a specific rescuer? Is there one that you say, well, in retrospect, I wish I had included that person?
I wish I could have included all of them. I think one story, I'm very interested in communities of rescue. And when the book came out, I wrote an article for the Wall Street Journal about that. And one story that is not in the book um, is about Albania, which is a fascinating story. I wish I had room to tell that story, actually, and in retrospect, probably might have, because it was a majority Muslim country. All three religions lived there peacefully, the Jews and the Christians back to Roman times. And FDR's ambassador to Albania was Jewish, said it's the only country in Europe that there's no religious bigotry. And, it was the only country in Europe that had more Jews at the end of it than at the beginning. And they have a hospitality code there called Besa, where they would rather die than let a guest in their home be captured or be endangered. And that was true of a guest in their country. And the Nazis at the Wannsee conference, when they listed all of the countries in, Poland, several million Jews, they listed Albania at 200 Jews. And so they were like not, they were aware of the Jews of Albania, but somehow this country, there was, again, more Jews at the end of the war than at the beginning of the war, which is unique. And again, all three religions there, monotheistic religions, living peacefully.
You touched on earlier, the diversity of the rescuers that you feature in the book. Could you just remind our audience the different countries that the rescuers represent, just to give a sense of?
Yeah. I mean, so I guess just the stories in the book would be, Portugal, Germany, Greece, Italy, Japan, Netherlands, Denmark, Poland, France, the UK, United States. There were some on the Free City of Danzig, which doesn't exist anymore. I'm probably leaving some out because some of these were group rescues, and so there were people that kind of joined the group from often refugees themselves. But those are most of the major Western countries.
Remarkable. Uh, each chapter, of course, is autonomous. You can read
Yeah.
one chapter without having read the previous chapter. Each one stands on its own in a very strong way. But I imagine the order in which you present the rescuers, these heroes, is not random. And I'm just curious how you decided which rescuers to present early in the book as opposed to those midway and those at the end of the book.
I think it was more subconscious than anything, but there's a rhythm to the book in terms of it starts with a very dramatic, large scale diplomatic, rescue of 30,000 people. And then it gets quieter and goes to German circus, which was sort of a totally weird story with a handful of people being rescued. And then there's sort of this rhythm where I have a bunch of large rescues paired in between with sort of smaller rescues. And then the book does, as it goes on, some of the harder stories are towards the end, like Irena Sendler. The last story in the book, which is the British POWs, takes place on the Death March, which would have been my second choice for the when you asked me about the hardest thing to write. So there's sort of a rhythm around both like type of rescue, the magnitude of rescue, but also just sort of like sheer geopolitical drama versus quieter.
I think the choice is excellent. There is an excellent flow through the book from the beginning right to the end. I'm curious, in your view, of all the rescuers that you feature in the book, which one paid the highest price, personally, professionally, or both, for having rescued Jews from the Nazis?
Well, for sure, I mean, I'm just thinking, so in Le Chambon, the one of the pastor, and I showed you had a cousin who came as a young guy as a schoolmaster, and he actually his house was rounded up like that. When he went with the children and died in a death camp. So he paid the ultimate price. He died, which a lot of there was a lot of rescuers who perished, many, and many were turned in, and so that was the ultimate price that was very real, and he had this. It's very beautiful. I mean, he was writing home to his parents even from these once he'd been captured because he was still able to get mail out about how he really felt he had found his calling with these children, and it was, I mean, it makes you want to cry. I think you rightly point out most rescuers in the book, in some way or another, almost suffered for what they did. Sousa Mendes, who was the largest rescue, was basically drummed out of the foreign service, lost his career, lost his fortune, died prematurely, was kind of ruined. Marion Fry was ostracized. Hiram Bingham was fired by the U.S. government for, defying his orders at the State Department. Oscar Schindler had rocks thrown at him. I mean, Irena Sendler, she was on, not only was she almost tortured, but after the war, she was received the Medal of, but behind the Iron Curtain, it was very dangerous because not only were you considered someone that liked Jews and there was institutional anti-Semitism, there was this sort of kind of suspicion that you worked with the Allies and you were anti-communist. And so there were many people with the medal that didn't want anyone to know it. Her children couldn't go to school because of what she did. So, Sugihara, the Japanese, he was fired by the foreign ministry. He had to go door to door at one point selling light bulbs. So many of them really were shunned or punished for what they did. I thought a lot about why that is, and I think there's lots of reasons, but I think fundamentally there's this resentment must have existed because it's very hard to say you couldn't have done anything, which a lot of people wanted to say when you were next door neighbor rescued, Jews. So, not everyone in the book, some people largely had a successful career. The circus people, Denmark got on with life, but some of them, sadly, a majority of them really suffered for what they did.
Sure. You mentioned, of course, earlier the two most famous, probably rescuers of Jews during the Holocaust that have received terrific recognition, namely Swedish diplomat Raoul Wallenberg, and then, of course, the German industrialist Oskar Schindler. They clearly have come in for tremendous attention, quite justifiably so. But I'm wondering, apart from Yad Vashem, which, of course, through their Righteous Among the Nations has honored these heroes, has the Jewish world and the non-Jewish world, have they done enough to recognize these heroes and others like them?
No. I mean, starting with Yad Vashem, I believe their criterion are way too strict. So, you have to have risked your life. There has to be eyewitness testimony. It doesn't quite capture people who did small things. It doesn't capture people who died rescuing. So I think they're too strict, but they do a good job, obviously. I think, the Holocaust Museum in Washington is redoing its exhibit and they will be featuring much more prominently rescue. But I mean, the Holocaust museums and the places like USC Shoah that try to document things they do a good job, but we as a culture do not do enough to honor these people at all. I mean, that's why they're unknown. I mean, different people late in many countries are celebrated now. Sousa Mendes is a national hero in Portugal. But even if you take like the Americans I mentioned, there's only been 5 Americans. Take Varian Fry, worked with, there were probably 10 key people in his circle, including Hiram Bingham, 2 women, Mary Jane Gold and Miriam Davenport, who were Americans. And Yad Vashem has decided to just give the medal to Varian Fry and said that's enough. It captures everyone else, and the United States does not recognize them. Like why? I don't know. So I think we can get into individual sort of cases and why they haven't been recognized, but in general, I mean, this is a very, very, very understudied area of the Holocaust for a variety of reasons that go back, but like it's just it's I think it's really important for education but it is starting to be incorporated in people who are interested in teaching the Holocaust or genocide. The book is being used in a bunch of curriculum now, but we as a culture we have not done anywhere near as enough to give these people their due.
In your studying of these various righteous among the nations who rescued Jews, of course, they come from diverse backgrounds, different socioeconomic levels, different religious affiliations, different nationalities, of course. But are there any common attributes or common denominators that link them all?
Yeah, I mean, I get asked that a lot because there wasn't, as I mentioned, for a variety of reasons, there was not a kind of any systematic. There was one systematic study that was done by Freudians, and I'll be brief on this because I know we want to get to questions. But let me say, I think uh, so. Most when you look at the rescuers, some patterns emerge. A lot of like people who were in international professions, whether it was diplomacy or cycling, tended to be more rescuers. People in creative professions tended to be more. I'd say more than anything, the single most important sort of motivator, most people believe in something greater than themselves. It could have been political, could have been something like the base of tradition, but more often than not, it was religion. But it was really people who took to heart the teachings, often Christianity, but of all 3 branches, but also Islam, like who really took to heart the teachings as opposed to like external displays of piety, which often went in the other direction. So like probably the parable of the Good Samaritan saved more Jews than anything else during the war. But I would say the one thing that I found that was universal was that every rescuer pretty much had somebody in their early childhood, usually a parent, but not always, who did 2 things. One is the obvious one, which is they told them like, we don't hate Jews, we don't hate the people who are different than us. Irena Sendler's father told her, if you see someone drowning, you must save them. But also, an unusual number of them actually grew up in loving households where they were valued, their interests were valued, and that's important because I've thought, why is that important? Because it creates self-esteem, and if you think about it, to be a rescuer when the entire world is turned upside down, to believe that your moral compass is correct and everyone else is wrong, and also to believe that if you take action, you could be successful, requires a very strong sense of self. And that candidly comes from, to a large degree, how you were treated as a child in your family and how you grew up. And so again, like most of the rescuers came out of loving, supportive families. But
Just a reminder that in a short while, we are going to be taking some questions from the audience for Richard. So if you have a question, and I notice there are already quite a few actually in our chat box, but you're welcome to submit your questions. I guess collectively, and you did refer to some numbers earlier, Richard, collectively, the rescuers in your book saved thousands, tens of thousands of Jews from what would have been near certain death at the hands of the Nazis. Could you mention perhaps just some of the more famous Jews, more prominent, more celebrated Jews that the rescuers in your book actually saved?
sure, yeah. There are quite a few, and I'll. Then there's a lot of people who like had huge impacts on the world that may not be household names, people who won like, the Fields Medal in mathematics. But among the more famous people, so like I opened the book with the story of the people who wrote Curious George, Hans and Marguerite Ray, who were literally bicycling with the manuscript of Curious George that Sousa Mendes gave them passports, and they ended visas. They ended up in Brazil. So he himself rescued them. Forgive me if some of these people aren't Jewish, but like Salvador Dali, most of the Rothschilds, the Habsburgs, Paul Rosenberg, who was Picasso and Matisse's dealer. the a number Sugihara rescued the only yeshiva to survive intact the war. In Denmark, one of the people they got across was Niels Bohr, who the physicist who then went on to join the Manhattan Project. Fry, obviously, and Bingham and their group saved many, many famous people, including, so you saw the picture of Marc Chagall, the surrealists like, Andre Breton, Max Ernst, many writers. You saw the picture of Leon Feuchtwanger, Heinrich Mann, the brother of Thomas Mann, Hannah Arendt, Marcel Duchamp. So just, like a laundry list of, in Le Chambon, there were a number of children that went through there, went on to like great success in terms of Nobel laureates, et cetera. And I mean, one of the people actually I should mention who who worked with Fry, who was Jewish, Albert Hirschman, became one of the most famous economists in the world, and they will use his formula, the HHI formula, in determining whether Netflix or Paramount can buy Warner Brothers. It was a very important antitrust formula. So, if you just read the Susan Mendez and the Fry chapters, it's an amazing, amazing list of people that owe their lives to those people.
Before we take a few questions from our audience for Richard, we want to give away 4 copies of In the Garden of the Righteous. And to do that, we're going to ask 4 questions to our audience, questions related to Richard's book. And if there's no correct answer, the person who answers as accurately as possible, the closest to the right answer, will be the winner of the book. And you can write your answers, of course, in the chat box at the bottom of the screen. So I'm now going to pose the 4 questions. Here we go. Question number 1. At Israel's National Holocaust Memorial, Yad Vashem, how many non-Jews have been honored for rescuing Jews during the Holocaust as part of its Righteous Among the Nations program? So please enter your answer now to question 1 in the chat box. Okay. Question number 2. As many people know, Poland is the country with the highest number of people recognized as righteous among the nations by Yad Vashem, with 7,318, followed by the Netherlands and then France. Which country is next on the Yad Vashem list? Okay, so please enter your answer now to question 2 in the chat box. Question number 3. On that same list, it may seem surprising that Denmark appears so low with only 22 individuals recognized, despite the fact that almost all of that country's Jews were saved from the Nazis. Why are so few Danes recognized as righteous among the nations by Yad Vashem? Please enter your answer now to question 3 in the chat box. Okay, and now to the final question, question number 4. In the introduction to Richard's book, he refers to the Evian Conference, which took place in France in July 1938, ostensibly to help Jews in Germany and Austria flee Nazi persecution. Of the 32 countries that attended, only 1 agreed to accept more Jewish refugees. What is that country? So please answer question number 4 now by putting your question in the chat box. And I should mention, in the next day or 2, we'll be notifying each of the winners so that we can get their respective addresses to mail out their copies of In the Garden of the Righteous. So now that you've all had a chance to respond to the contest questions, I'm going to read out the correct answers. And starting with each question, you'll see if you were close or on the money with your answers. Okay, Question number 1 was at Israel's National Holocaust Memorial, Yad Vashem. How many non-Jews have been honored for rescuing Jews during the Holocaust as part of the Righteous Among the Nations program? And according to the most recently published figures, Yad Vashem has recognized 28,707 men and women from 51 countries as righteous among the nations since the program first officially began in 1963. Excuse me. Question number 2. As many people know, Poland is the country with the highest number of people recognized as righteous among the nations, with 7,318, followed by the Netherlands and then France. Which country is next on the list? The answer, following Poland, the Netherlands, and France on that list, is Ukraine, with 2,713 individuals honored. Question number 3, on that same list, as we said earlier, it may seem surprising that Denmark appears so low, with only 22 individuals recognized, despite almost all of its Jews were saved from the Nazis. So why are so few Danes recognized officially by Yad Vashem? Be interesting to see what the answers that you gave for that question. Yad Vashem awards the title of Righteous Among the Nations to individuals, not to groups. The members of the Danish resistance viewed their famous rescue operation of their country's Jews as a collective act, and therefore they asked Yad Vashem not to recognize resistant members individually. Yad Vashem respected their request, and consequently, the number of Danish righteous among the nations is relatively small at Yad Vashem. Final question. In the introduction to Richard's book, he refers to the Evian Conference, which took place in France in July 1938, ostensibly to help Jews in Germany and Austria seeking to flee Nazi persecution. Of the 32 countries that attended, only 1 agreed to accept more Jewish refugees. What was that country? Of the 32 countries, only the Dominican Republic agreed to open its doors to Jews fleeing persecution in Germany and Austria. Sadly, tragically, little real action came out of that conference, making it clear to the Nazis that while other countries didn't necessarily approve of their anti-Jewish policies, they wouldn't actively take steps against the Nazis to go out of their way to help the Jews. So we look forward to going over all your answers and then notifying the 4 winners in the next day or 2. Before taking questions from the audience, I have just one last question for Richard, then we'll look at the chat box for questions from the audience. And if you could just say briefly, Richard, what are you hoping people take away when they read your book?
Well, in addition to everything that I said about sort of, I guess, learning about these people and maybe being inspired to learn about other people who did this during the war and some of the lessons about, what we can do to create more people who would act this way, even on a smaller scale with less dramatic consequences, but just kindness and sort of, I hope that the book provides people with some degree of inspiration and hope in difficult times. I don't think we're living through the Holocaust or anything like that, but these are very difficult times, and morality seems at sea. And so I think the fact that these people at the worst time acted this way is hopeful, and I hope so. I hope it's it's difficult to say you wrote a positive book about the Holocaust, but I hope people take some degree of inspiration and hope from the book.
Okay. Now let's turn to questions from our audience for Richard, and the first actually is one from Brian Nemeth of Toronto, who submitted his question by email a few days ago. And here's his question. Right now in our present day world, we are seeing rising anti-Semitism and threats to Jewish people. What does it mean, or what does it take to be considered a hero to Jews today? Is there a current version of the brave, heroic people that you wrote about in your book?
Well, those I think are two separate questions. So I think yes, there have been 40 genocides since World War II. I'll go on the record. I don't want to get bogged down that I don't think one of them is going on in Gaza, which is tragedy, but it's not. But there have been 40 genocides, and in all of them, there have been rescuers that have come up. So I mean, I recently met with Paul Rusesabagina, who saved 1,600 people during and if you've seen the movie Hotel Rwanda during the Rwandan genocide, and these heroes that continue to exist. There were people on October 7th, Muslims who've died trying to save Jews from Hamas. So they're always, they always have been out there. I mean, the righteous concept comes back from, the Talmud and the Bible about they're always righteous in every generation. In terms of who are heroes for Jews, I mean, honestly, I think anybody who speaks out right now against anti-Semitism is to me as a hero because it's very easy not to, and it's very trouble. I am very worried about the rise in anti-Semitism. You mentioned earlier I've done a lot on issues around liberal democracy. It's obviously one of the signs, very disturbing signs, is the rise in anti-Semitism for the kind of the stability of the system, and we are seeing it unfortunately from the left and the right in different forms, but very virulent. And, I think the right wing strain of this, at least in the United States, has started to really pick up in the last few months. And so I think it's really important because I do think the vast majority of people, certainly in the United States, I would think in Canada and probably a lot of people in the rest of the kind of free world are mostly people of goodwill, but they're drowned out. And I think it's really important, though, at a time when I have a friend of mine who is like the definitive book on Churchill, is out defending this against the concept that Winston Churchill was the villain of World War II and not Hitler, is now on podcasts. I think it's very important we all speak out against it. And non-Jews, I think, have a particularly important role to play because, they don't have an axe to grind in it. And so their, voices calling out anti-Semitism, I think, are really important and we need to support them.
We have a question here from Janet Fine. Of course, Richard, earlier on, you referred to the case of Albania having saved its Jewish population during the Holocaust. Janet asks about Bulgaria. She refers to a book titled Beyond Hitler's Grasp and asks about their story. Is it analogous to what happened in Albania?
Yeah, so sorry, I have a specific view on Bulgaria, and I see the comment. I mean, the Bulgarians were very good. Not necessarily the czar, but the church, and there was a particular member of parliament, and they did save their Jews, and they worked very hard to protect their Jews. So very many Bulgarian Jews were rescued, and in that sense, it is often put in the category rightfully with places like Denmark and Albania. This is a debate I have with my friend Abe Foxman, who ran the ADL, who's a big Bulgaria fan. The reason I have a little asterisk against them is that in Greece was divided into three sections. It was divided into the German occupied section, which is where most of the Jews were annihilated, the Italian section, where, wherever the Italians were, they didn't do roundups, and the Bulgarian section. And the Bulgarians did not treat the Greek Jews well. They deported them, and they did it because they wanted to gain land in Thrace. My degree is actually in ancient history, and that's sort of the ancestral. In ancient times, the Bulgarians, were the Thracians. And so while they did a very good job, very heroic, protecting the Bulgarian Jews, they did not, they basically deported the Thracian Jews. So to me, that's a mark on their record.
Okay, interesting perspective there. We have time for one last question. We have a question here from Deborah Hemph, and I'll read it. It says, I apologize for raising an unhappy topic, but I read or heard somewhere that Varian Fry, the American, was snubbed after the war by some of the famous artists and intellectuals that he rescued. Do you know if there is truth to that? And if so, how would you explain that?
This is a very well-informed audience, I must say. That is true. Specifically, and I write about it in the book, on the what the organization Varian Fry started turned into what we now know as the IRC, and on its 25th anniversary, he decided to put together a print portfolio of prints of many of the artists that he rescued, and he was shunned. People did not appreciate what he did. The level of ingratitude was unbelievable. He was devastated by it. When he did go to Europe on that tour, André Malraux actually surprised him with the Legion of Honor, which was sort of that's how upset he was, that was sort of like they did that to make him feel better. Not all of the artists. I mean, Lipschutz was very, positive, was very like grateful, and so not all of them, but an unusual number of them. And how would I explain it? I don't know if you spend time around celebrities, but there is like a narcissism that goes with this. Andre Breton, when he was asked to write an introduction for this, the founder of Surrealism, who owed his life to Fry and actually got to know him quite well in Marseille. His assistant said, Monsieur Breton's already given you a signed copy of his memoir. This is enough. So, yeah, ingratitude is a very unusual, unfortunate aspect of human nature, and the only thing that's particularly sad is that Fry himself was pretty devastated by this, and I think it's one of the reasons that he sort of ended up kind of having a breakdown. He died prematurely of a heart attack, but I think he was a pretty devastated, and he just really had trouble getting his head around the kind of coldness that he experienced from these people who he thought A, were his friends, and B, who literally owed their lives to him.
Wow, quite sobering. Well, that brings us to the close of this latest installment of FSWC's Book Talk series. I want to express my appreciation to everyone who took the time to be with us here this evening. And of course, a special thank you to Richard for being our featured guest today.
Well, thank you. I want to thank you for having me. This was a wonderful conversation and an extremely well-informed, interesting audience. So thank you.
Thank you for that. And for anyone interested in purchasing In the Garden of the Righteous, and I highly recommend it. It was really very powerful read. It's available at all good bookstores in Canada, also available online if you want to pick up your own copy. We hope you'll be able to join us for our next edition of Book Talk, which will be in the new year on January 13th, when our guest will be Matthew Goodman, who will be join us to discuss his gripping nonfiction book, Paris Undercover. As always, we invite you to send us your feedback and your suggestions of writers for future editions of Book Talk and books that you think might be of interest to our community. So on behalf of Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center, again, thank you for everyone for being here this evening, and we wish you a good night. And thank you again, Richard, for a great presentation.